After 2 years of upheaval, the world is slowly recovering from the pandemic, but inequities in healthcare remain.
The ongoing vaccine crisis is a scandalous inequity that's perpetuating the pandemic.
The racial wealth gap is widening.
A lot of the Black and brown people in the United States work at the lower end of the socioeconomic employment ladder.
Progress on gender equality is stalling.
About 2.5 million women have dropped out or have been forced out of the workforce during the pandemic.
And we're at risk of a lost generation.
Access to education was never equal or fair in the first place, but the disruptions that we're seeing today are causing disparities that are really quite astounding.
But the crisis also gives us an opportunity. We now have a window to light the path to a brighter future. At the Bloomberg Equality Summit, we bring together leaders from across the globe to design a new blueprint for a world in crisis. This is the Bloomberg Equality Summit.
Hello and welcome to the Bloomberg Equality Summit. I'm John Micklethwaite, Editor-in-Chief at Bloomberg. The conversation on diversity, equity and inclusion has become more urgent. And here at Bloomberg, we want to be part of these discussions and, where we can, lead them. As journalists who are part of one of the world's largest newsrooms, we believe it's critical. And we've been covering news around equality for years. Issues around pay disparity, childcare, workplace diversity, and the digital divide. But there's no doubt that 2020 was a turning point. The events of that summer, especially George Floyd, made us and many other people rethink the way we cover equality. And we decided it was time to broaden our coverage. Today, we have the Bloomberg Equality Vertical. That's a multi-platform global initiative, and it's a vital part of our newsroom, led by Rax Saluja. We have a dedicated team covering ESG. And I think it's interesting that the E part of ESG receives a lot of attention, but the S and the G parts are hugely important too. Racial audits, transparency, diversity on boards, the pay gap, sexual harassment, and mandatory arbitration. I think all these things are becoming integral to investing strategy, important to people about where they make money, as well as to society as a whole. Our job is to continue to report on these efforts and, where possible, hold the companies who are either doing this or claiming they're doing this, hold them accountable. But that is just the beginning. We're building up diversity databases on many of the world's biggest companies. We have the Bloomberg Gender Equality Index now in its 7th reporting cycle. We have the new Voices Initiative, which is to train up diverse voices to appear on all media, not just Bloomberg TV and QuickTake, though obviously I think that's preferable. So there is a lot going on, and this Equality Summit, I hope, will reflect that and be part of that. So I'm excited to see what happens. And now I'm going to hand over to our Deputy New York Bureau Chief, Shartia Brantley. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Bloomberg Equality Summit. We are thrilled you can join us. Our theme for this event is Modern Leaders and Allies. As the next generation of employees enters the workplace, bringing their own voices and views to issues around workplace equality, we will convene global leaders on the front lines of education, wealth, technology, government, and business to talk about the next phase of oversight and accountability. Who are the agitators charting a new and faster course to achieve equity and change? What tough discussions are necessary to create sustainable change? We'll explore these and other pressing issues over the next 2 days. Before we get started, a couple of announcements. First, I would like to acknowledge our presenting sponsors, Boston Consulting Group and P&G. Our supporting sponsor, RBC Capital Markets, and our community partner, United Negro College Fund. If you experience any issues with audio or video quality, try to refresh your browser or use the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen for support. You will be able to submit questions during the interviews. We hope you engage with us. While we're probably not going to get to all of you, we'll try our best. To submit a question, please click open the white tab on the right-hand side of the video window. If you note your name and location, we'll give you a shout out. For today's event, we have partnered with Listen, an audio to text platform that is transcribing today's discussion in real time, making the event more accessible. You can access Listen for the real-time transcription via the link in the session description. Social media, please engage with us using hashtag Bloomberg Equality. And you can engage with other attendees in the event chat. That's at the bottom right corner of your screen. And now, let's get started with our first session. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Karen Toulon, Chief Correspondent of Bloomberg Equality and host Black in Focus. Karen.
Hello and welcome to our conversation about Wall Street's talent equation with Suzanne Donahoe, partner and global head of strategic growth and co-chair of the Inclusion and Diversity Council at KKR. We also have Vern Perry, global head of Blackstone Strategic Partners, and Cedron Thomas, president of Northern Trust Asset Management. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Great to be here.
So we have a lot of ground to talk about. The math around Wall Street's talent equation has never been more complex. There's a changing global workforce and customer demographics, increased awareness by a wide variety of stakeholders, and a sense of urgency in these times of racial reckoning. So I thought we'd start off looking at recruiting. And Suzanne, I'm going to come to you first. When we were chatting earlier, you talked about having a strategic plan that for what great looks like within your firm. You know, that notion of what does great look like? How does KKR actually build that into its recruiting efforts?
It's a great question. So thank you for that. I would say that we've been on the diversity and inclusion journey for quite a number of years at KKR. And I think one of the things we figured out is anything that's built to last is something that takes time, takes planning, and takes a long-term commitment. So one of the things that we've really done is focused our efforts, whether it's on recruitment or actually on retention or promotion and development of our colleagues, to be a multi-year journey and to be one that we're consistently measuring progress on and thinking creatively about how we can better address the representation challenges that we may face currently in our firm and really make our workplace a super attractive place for all different types of professionals.
So, Cedron, I want to pick up there with the notion of who's doing this work. If you want a diverse workforce, how important is it that the people who are doing the recruiting and partner organizations, that they are diverse as well? Does that matter?
Well, I think it matters, but and what I would say, I would extend it beyond that. One, when we think about our strategy and the execution of that, the recruitment effort is not just by professionals in HR. The recruitment effort has to be part and parcel with those who are on the line. And it's absolutely the case that not only are HR professionals or those who are responsible for that staff function need to reflect the community, the broad and diverse community we're trying to recruit, but also our line partners and especially our leadership. And so we started at the top such that what we're trying to do and what we're trying to reproduce is reflected by, in a sense, the ambassadors that we send out.
Wow, so that's a lot of people involved. How, and this, Vern, this question goes to you. With all this recruiting, all these different players and actors involved, how important are metrics, measuring results, and what works at your firm?
Well, first, let me just say I agree completely with my two fellow panelists. In terms of metrics, I think if you think about recruiting, you want to keep track of progress. So people tend to focus on things that are measured. and they know that they're being held accountable. So I think metrics are important, but I would go back to something Chandran said. It's absolutely important that there's a partnership between the business side and HR to make this work. And so HR has the metrics, they can inform the business side. Here at Blackstone, we get those metrics quarterly. I'm a business head, so as a business head, I get that. I can measure progress. That's important.
So I'm going to stay with you, Vern. So part of recruiting is retention, and with that accountability. You know, what after people get hired, what actually happens to them after they join the organization. And so at Blackstone, you do this measuring on a quarterly basis. Is there anything else that you do that kind of helps cement that relationship between business objective and the business units who are trying to just get on with things?
I think that's a great question. I think the most important thing about recruiting is retention. I think a lot of people focus 100% on recruiting. It's the wrong angle. You have to retain, develop, promote, coach. So recruiting isn't about the short term. It's about the long term. You're supposed to be recruiting people that can make it up the ranks. And so for me, measurement's important. Working with all of our business colleagues, that's important. And so one of the things that we do, we have a diverse professionals network. I happen to be the founder of that network back in 2014. When we bring people in, we have dine-arounds where senior people meet with junior, mid-level talent to make sure they're comfortable, to make sure they feel included. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, a big part of that is inclusion. If you feel like you're being heard, you feel that people see you where you are, you're likely to stay.
So Suzanne, Vern touched on this. Is this a long-term game? Is this a multi-year process and should be measured thusly, not in terms of how are we doing this year, but how are we doing in X amount of years?
It really is, Karen, a very long-term game, I think, and one that you got to stay focused on. I would say that as we think about retention and the development of all of our employees, but particularly our diverse employees and our women, what we're very focused on is making sure that people have a community that they feel connected to, making sure our employees have mentors or buddies when they join the firm to really help them get acclimated, and making sure that our community is one that's inclusive and welcoming, where people feel they can really bring their authentic selves to work. But what we're trying to do is set objectives that look out over a 3 or a 5 year horizon and measure progress. We tend to think about it very similarly to the way we make investments. So when we make an investment, we have a thesis, we have a plan for how that business will develop, and we're accountable for ensuring that success over time. And we view the bringing on of new people into our culture very similarly. So we're carefully selecting and then having a plan together with that person over time for their careers, going to develop opportunities or assignments are important to helping them develop a skill set and an experience base that ultimately can lead to great things for them.
And Suzanne, how are these best intentions supported? Is pay tied to results? How do you keep that going?
Yes, great question. What we've really focused on is making sure that we have strong business unit leader accountability. So just the way Vern mentioned, at Blackstone, he gets quarterly reports that help keep his business unit on track. We similarly have game plans for each of our underlying business units. And the reality is what diversity or inclusion looks like from team to team in different parts of the globe and in different business units will vary. So we're really trying to design what great looks like, to your earlier comment, and then make sure that we're staying progress. And in some cases, we may have unique challenges to a particular business unit. So we're trying to support the business unit challenges and then help resources or people to help address those opportunities.
Okay, we're cutting out a little bit. Chandran, I want to come to you. I'm assuming that leaders throughout your firm, but also leaders perhaps outside of your firm, come to you seeking your counsel. What are your thoughts on guiding organizations through retention and accountability?
Yeah, so I think this is a essential question. And so there are three areas that I put at the very top of the list. One, you've got to foster inclusion. Two, you've got to, in a sense, enable opportunities. And finally, you got to provide sponsorship. In terms of fostering inclusion, I go back to Vern's comment. It's so important. People don't want to be seen as a caricature or a stereotype. They want to be seen and heard for who they really are, and they want their contributions and who they are to be valued. And so that's so critically important. To be clear, these are things that can be measured. And so if you think about things like engagement, like we measure engagement and we look at the metadata. So we look at it across our population, but we look at it across different ethnicities, across gender. And this is telling us how people are experiencing our culture and their level of commitment to it and how they're experiencing it. And we make that part of the way that we measure our managers. If you think about this thought about opportunities, one of the things, quite frankly, we found is when we really dug down into the data, not only just measuring promotions like titles, right? But actually roles, because many of the roles in the organization, they come from informal promotion, so to speak. It's managers individually determining what we call a manager-enabled move. And we found that before we were tracking this and measuring it, these weren't happening equitably for women and people of color. But once we know the data, once we're measuring it, once we're holding people accountable for it, that's different. So provide opportunities. The last is sponsorship. I'm sure we'll talk about things like allyship and mentorship. Yep. But at the end of the day, sponsorship is critical because those are the people in the room giving access to the opportunities and determining how people are viewed, especially when they make the inevitable mistakes.
So I have a data point here. Here at Bloomberg, we started a corporate responsibility tracking project about 1.5 years ago to make companies' racial, ethnic, and gender diversity data more public. Over that time, the number of companies that have provided data has increased from 25 to 76 out of the 100 biggest public companies. But leadership positions are still overwhelmingly male and white. And so, Vern, you touched on this a little bit in the beginning. I want to just dig a little bit into things that are actually working in your firms. And Vern, you mentioned these small groups where employees can actually bump up against senior managers or other influencers within the firm. Why is that so important to that feeling of inclusion? And also, more importantly, perhaps to that next step of promotion?
That's a great question. I think it's important because these sort of small group dinners allows for junior, mid-level people to have access to potential sponsors. Shundron has it right. Mentorship is good. Sponsorship is great. Sponsors will speak on your behalf, put their name on the line in rooms you may not be in. And so these small group settings allow for people to get the insights, the culture. Everything that we're talking about should permeate culture. It's not just about a list that we check off or being held accountable during a review or 360. It's about the culture. So this is about the culture. And here at Blackstone, it's important for us to give folks a sense of what senior leadership is thinking. It's not just that, it's programming, having successful people of color, having women come in and tell our people why they were successful, the pitfalls they avoided or didn't avoid. So having that sort of connectivity is critical.
Suzanne, I want to come to you now. Hopefully we have your audio okay. Middle managers are literally often just smack in the middle. They're trying to do their job in the now, maybe a bit of a time horizon, but they're increasingly being asked to think about these bigger picture, longer term talent and retention issues. How do you battle against that urge to kind of just, I need to fill this position right now. I just need to get this done. I need to go to someone that I know, I trust, to keep things moving along. How do you deal with that at KKR?
It's such a great question. So perceptive about one of the challenges to really work through. And I would say there's probably 3 elements to it. One is authenticity and really having that group of people feel the organizational commitment and share the organizational commitment. So I think it really does start at the top But to your question, often that is the level at which much of the hiring is getting done. And so I think you need to have process that's attentive to what the end objectives are. They need to understand those end objectives and really be bought in to developing a more diverse workplace over time. And I think part of how you do that is you engage them and solicit their ideas, ensure there's enough time in hiring decisions, ensure there are diverse slates of candidates. And then ultimately, to come back to something you were asking about before, we also believe that reward should follow achievement of metrics in the same way that it does for any other business imperative. So we think that if we've got someone who's excelling at enhancing our culture and bringing a more inclusive ethos to the firm, that's something that should be rewarded, and people should feel that through promotion and through compensation. So it's really all of those tenets together that I think helps mobilize that middle management layer.
And Chandran, I want to come back to you. You already mentioned sponsorship, mentorship, and allyship. For people who are still a little murky, how are they different, and how does that sponsorship really show up in the workplace? How essential is it?
Sure. So if I gave you my simple alliteration, the first thing I would say is when you think of allies, it's who's helping you. When you think of sponsors, it's who's coaching you. And when you think, when you think of mentors, it's who's coaching you. And when you think of sponsors, it's who's backing you, right? And so again, I go back to this very practical thing. Vern was just talking about it. We need allies. We don't do anything of substantial value alone in the workplace. We work in community. We need mentors and coaches to really guide us through. A lot of times it's the ropes to skip and the ropes to know, not the technical, but the cultural elements. But on that sponsorship that you mentioned, access to opportunity is not equitable in the world that we know today. And so sponsors are going to be able to, in a sense, put their credibility on the line to make sure that there's more access to these opportunities for people that they're sponsoring. Here's what's also important. We're all dealing in organizations where people are, in a sense, have a brand. And how is that? You don't need to necessarily worry about managing your brand. You do need people, in a sense, that are speaking on your behalf. And so those people who understand who you are, what you're contributing, and again, I point this out, we'll all make mistakes. Are they stumbling blocks or are they stepping stones? Sponsors affect that materially. And that's why I think it's such an important thing for us to focus on. The last thing I would say, every single one of us as leaders in organizations has an affirmative responsibility to provide sponsorship for people in the organization.
And how does that sponsorship happen? Does it need to be a formal relationship? Is there a team of people who says, these are our high flyers, potential high flyers within our organization. Let's make sure that they have a sponsor and that their sponsor is actually doing the role that sponsor should be doing. How does that work? I'll put that to Vern.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I would argue that it happens quite organically. You're not assigned a sponsor. It's like showing up at your home and your mom says, hey, I want to introduce you to your new friend. That's not how life works. So typically someone may start off as an ally. If you're lucky, they become a mentor. Doesn't necessarily have to be that way. But mentors see someone that's trying hard. They want to help you. And so excellence begets mentors. And so, but over time, it has to be it can't be assigned. And so what I would say, a mentor could progress into a sponsor. It could be a client. It could be someone that you report to. But I would say that it has to be built based on trust, communication. But again, it has to happen organically. You're not assigned a sponsor.
But to play devil's advocate, Suzanne, theoretically in a very large organization, there may be someone who is extremely talented, who is spot on for that next stage of the company, someone who's really going to drive the culture and as importantly, drive the business. But they may not be the type of person who garners just naturally a lot of attention. How do they not slip through the cracks? Who's paying attention then?
It's a great question. I think often one thing I've seen happen is with the right type of management and coaching. There may also be a cultivation of the relationship building skills that it takes to form that sponsorship, and also some settings like Vern was referencing earlier, those I'll call it maybe cultivated dinner settings or whatever it may be, that give people access and exposure and an opportunity to share their ideas and show their excitement and enthusiasm for the projects they're working on and the direction of the organization. So I think it's both having the audience to make an impression, and then, in some cases it really may be how to forge those relationships or create those settings in the first place. But then I would say there's a lot that's to be said about the individual. In all of our organizations, I think there's an expectation that as individuals are getting more senior, they also have to have game to be able to create and forge and really take those relationships to the next level. So those are some of the things that we're looking at. But I think fundamentally, the manager is a big person. We're accountable for helping that individual create the connection to lead to those sponsorship relationships.
Right, and Chandra, I'm going to ask you, and then we'll do a little quick lightning round. But again, if that manager, perhaps in Suzanne's model, isn't quite able to do that work, or notice that someone who is very promising is kind of perhaps getting a little dejected or feeling a little undervalued, what can an organization do to step in? What do you do at your firm?
Well, I think the importance is being proactive. So as a senior leader and one of the senior most in my organization, I create the environment and I create the expectations. So I have to use those tools. And think about Vern's examples. We can leverage our affinity or resource councils and the like. We can create conversations, which we do in our environment. We've established values. We have 5 shared values. Diversity is one of them. So all of those things are creating an environment. But I want to be clear. Then I create the expectations. I have specific expectations in all of my reports for all my direct reports that tie to diversity, equity, inclusion. And even in those conversations, I'm being very pointed. I have no discomfort in asking them, who are you sponsoring? And so these are the things that we do to not only create the environment, but to make sure we actually get the outcomes.
So we have about 4 minutes left. This is a great conversation. So a little lightning round. Is there a particular challenge and a solution that seems to be working for your team right now when you look at DEI? And I'll start off with you, Suzanne. Is there some real practical advice for people who are watching or listening or thinking, I'm not as far along as I'd like to be within my organization? What seems to really work well?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that we've been very focused on and proud of is that when we really look at our ecosystem, one of the ways we can impact the world to the greatest extent is to focus on our portfolio companies. So we have about 1,700 employees at KKR, but we have about 700,000 employees when we look across the portfolio companies we own. And so when we said, how can we do more to really impact equity in the world and make the world a more fair place? One of the opportunities we have is through real work and stewardship at the portfolio companies. And so as a result of that, we've driven significant progress on board representation for all the companies that we control. We've focused on having both people of color and women on all of the boards of the companies we control, with the theory that once the boards are more well represented, that will also drive progress in the C-suite. It will drive progress through the middle of those organizations. And ultimately, that is one of the greatest impacts we can have on economic mobility. So that's something that we've been very focused on over the last 2 or 3 years. And we'll stay on it and keep pushing for even greater progress.
Vern, what about you? I mean, this is, again, we're moving so beyond diversity just for diversity's sake. We have, shareholders looking at this from an ESG perspective. What in the final 2 minutes, what advice would you give?
Well, first of all, I think all of us can do a better job of telling our story. If we don't tell our story, someone else will, and the narrative will be incorrect. And so part of that, telling that story, is increasing the funnel of schools from which we recruit. And so, in 2015, Blackstone recruited from 9 schools. That's it. Today it's 44, including HBCUs like Chandran's alma mater, Florida A&M, like my alma mater, Morehouse College, which happens to be the premier HBCU. No offense, Chandran. Look, we have to do a better job of telling our story. So not just people, not just our clients, people in our industry know what we do for the economy, for the companies in which we invest. We have to do a better job of telling our story. If we do that, we're going to attract more talent. They're going to say, wait a second, I didn't know Chandran existed. I didn't know Vern Perry existed. If they're there, perhaps I can be there. Perhaps I can succeed. And so if we do that in a real way, we'll increase the funnel. We can take that raw talent that's out there, by the way. It's not a supply issue. It's partly a demand issue, partly a lack of exposure issue. So if we can do that, we'll do a great job. Once they get in the door, we have programs like future women leaders, future diverse leaders. There's so many things that we can do programmatically once they get in the door.
And so, Chandran, you're going to be the final word here. Your good colleague from the proud nation of Morehouse suggested that we have to do a better job of telling our stories. How do you? What is that? What does that look like? Is that more town halls within companies, more events like this? How do you get your story out if that's important? If you see that as something that's essential?
Yeah. As leaders, our voice is one of our most powerful tools. I would end with a thought on, for me, it's cascading accountability. I start with a transparency around the responsibilities that I have. I share that with all of the people throughout the organization. I'm proud to say that when I joined our executive management team, I was the only person that was diverse on that team. We had no women. Today, we have singularly, I believe, one of the most diverse teams in asset management. 2/3 of my direct reports are either women or ethnic minorities, and that's true for our expanded leadership team. If you look at where we recruit, who we do business with, and those are all things I'm accountable for. So we take that, we take it down each level, we make it specific and personal, and that's how we can drive real outcomes in what we do.
That's going to have to be the final word for our look at Wall Street's talent equation. I want to thank you all so much, Suzanne Donahoe from KKR, Vern Perry, Blackstone Strategic Partners, and of course, Chandran Thomas from Northern Trust Asset Management. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day.
For more than 75 years, UNCF, the United Negro College Fund, has worked to combat deep-rooted obstacles to higher educational access, achievement, and career success, annually providing financial and educational support to our 37-member historically Black colleges and universities. Please give what you can. UNCF, our HBCUs, and our students appreciate you and your donation, no matter how big or small. A mind is a terrible thing to waste.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this session on closing the wealth gap through alternative investments. My name is Stacey Marie Ishmael, and I am the managing editor for cryptocurrencies here at Bloomberg News. I am truly delighted to have a multinational panel joining us today. I will start by briefly introducing each of them. I'll start with our visitor who's furthest away. So we have Blair Halliday, who's the head of the UK for Gemini, which is a cryptocurrency exchange. We have Deidre McIntyre, founding admin for Black People in Cryptocurrency. And last but absolutely not least, we have Sean Wilkinson, who is the founder and chief strategy officer for Storage. Nice to meet you all. Thank you for joining us here today. So I want to just kick this off by saying, we are in a particularly interesting time, day, week, month for all things cryptocurrency. I can tell you that from my perspective as a person who is reporting on this for a living, there seems to be more and more news every single day about what's happening. Just in the last, let's pick 2 months as an example, we've had El Salvador say it's going to start accepting Bitcoin as a form of legal tender. We've, of course, also seen record prices for Bitcoin as well as various of the other coins. We've seen record-breaking levels of interest in NFTs or non-fungible tokens. But one of my big questions and something I'm very interested in having us talk about today is, well, what does this really mean for folks sitting at home who are thinking, I don't have $66,000 to spend on something that I'm not sure what to do with? And Deidre, I'd really love for you to kind of kick us off on the question of, somebody who is perhaps watching this panel or who's WhatsApping their friends about, I heard about this thing called crypto, what should I be doing? What would you tell them?
Absolutely. I think, and thank you for having me on this panel. I think that one of the first steps is just to do a lot of reading and just to become familiar with what is out there and what Bitcoin is. It's not that you have to learn all the bolts and cable and different things and what to do, but you definitely have to have some type of sense as to what you're getting into and what the risks are. And, for the most part, people need to know that this is a shift very similar to what the email had on the mailing of correspondence. At one point, it wasn't too long ago, people drafted letters with pen and paper or a typewriter. But how often are we really doing that today? We had this internet tool called email that did that. Well, now we have this shift in which currency can be transferred just as simply as email. So what does that mean in terms of conducting business or how business will be conducted in the future? And I think people have seen it, even though if they're not familiar with Bitcoin, they've seen within the last even 5 or 6 years how many more people are using Zelle and Cash App and all types of digital. And Bitcoin is directly responsible for that because Bitcoin was the first to use QR code to act a currency, specifically digital cryptocurrency. Concept going, then
Deidre, we are losing you just a little bit.
And research and try to figure out what direction they take. And we always say that the most conservative, when you really don't know what to do, is just to stick.
Got it. Thank you. So just to make sure, because you were breaking up a little bit,
so
you have this really interesting metaphor as, Bitcoin and crypto kind of transforming various industries in the same way that email has made typewriters and stamps obsolete. And as somebody who still loves stationery, I think that that's an interesting analogy in that the rate of innovation and the rate of change might be something that folks feel like they can't necessarily kind of keep up with. And so, your encouragement to people to do research and to understand what's out there, I think, is really important. And Blair, I'm going to pick on you because former compliance officers do love research. Can you share just a little bit about what you've seen in the context of the kinds of risks that folks might encounter and how the work that you're doing is helping folks, make better decisions?
Yeah, look, I think they're first off, many thanks for having me on the panel. Really great to be here today. Look, in terms of, the risks of cryptocurrency in general, like many different assets, there is volatility and it can be subject to price swings. And I think, as Deidre was kind of mentioning before, there is always a kind of a risk in investing, and as part of your investment portfolio in the way that you're looking to invest in the things, it is important that you understand your own particular risk tolerance and ensure that you're never investing funds more than you can afford to lose, as is applicable to cryptocurrency in the same way as it is applicable to traditional finance. I think the important thing about crypto in general and kind of making sure that you're secure in that space is making sure that you're going to venues that you can kind of take a lot of trust and confidence in. So if you look in the UK in particular, we're relatively new into the legislative phase for crypto, but the Fifth Money Laundering Directive is now in force. It's been in force here for a couple of years now, and as part of that, crypto asset firms are required to be registered with the Financial Conduct Authority, which is the equivalent to the SEC or other such things over in the US. And so as a result of that, firms have to go through a level of review required standards in relation to kind of anti-money laundering requirements, which means that a consumer can get a lot of confidence that a firm has gone through the rigmarole, has demonstrated a high level of standard and control, that has been subject to review by the regulator and has been approved. And so, to give an example, in the UK, there's very few firms that have gone through that process in terms of that have received the full approval. We're one of, I think it's 12 firms that have gone through that process. So I think the really important thing is to understand your own personal circumstances. And when you're looking to kind of go into crypto, it's really important you go, going onto an exchange that you can trust, that has a track record, that has the kind of regulatory approvals and oversight that you would expect of other kind of traditional financial methods.
Thank you. And it is very helpful that for folks in the UK, they can genuinely just Google cryptocurrency exchanges regulated FCA and be able to find such a list. There isn't really anything comparable here in the US. And Sean, before we get a little bit into kind of your story about how you have used cryptocurrencies in really innovative ways, what I'd love is just for you to share your perspective on, in light of that, shall we say, lack of clarity for folks here, what are some of the kinds of conversations you find yourself having with people?
Sure. It's definitely an interesting time period for someone who's been in the Bitcoin and crypto space since 2012. We like to call these the summer periods. There's a lot of excitement in what's going on in the in the space. The price of Bitcoin and other crypto assets is rising. I'm suddenly getting calls from family members that thought crypto assets were dead, and so there's certainly a lot of excitement in the space right now. What I like to really point people towards in terms of answering the core question of this panel in terms of bridging the wealth gap. Bitcoin and these other crypto assets are really a new asset class. And if you look at, the newer generations, they're not necessarily, writing checks to each other. They're using things like Cash App and other things. And so if you think of what the future is going to be of money assets, it's really going to look a lot more like Bitcoin and these other assets. And in terms of bridging the wealth gap, I think it's really important to note that when people think of Bitcoin and other assets, they really think in terms of, is this something that I should invest in? And I really like to point people towards, earning cryptocurrency. When I started out in 2012 with Bitcoin, I was a broke college student, but I had a little, I had a computer that I could use, and some free electricity in the dorm room. And so I mined half Bitcoin a day. Now, certainly that's a lot more than it was back then, but that was my start to crypto. And it really didn't cost me anything to start to play around and explore in this space. And so that's one thing that I really point people towards and trying to have a conversation around is getting into the space doesn't necessarily mean you put up, $66,000, but you can start to play with some of these applications and research and participate in communities and earn your very, start into this ecosystem. So that's where I like to point people towards.
I will note that we're sort of long past the phase of sort of free money made by mining. It's much more expensive than what you're describing right now, even if folks might have that good free college electricity in those dorm rooms. One of the things that I was so fascinated by when I was looking at your background is this idea that you had been you're an entrepreneur, you run a company, you were out there kind of looking to get sort of venture capital attention and raising, and you came up with this novel idea, especially particularly for the time that you were doing it, of selling tokens instead of saying like, hey, here's equity. Can you talk a little bit more about how you used crypto as really a way to fund your operations and kind of, really enable you to be where you are right now?
Sure. So going back to that, very first portion where I was just mining Bitcoin, getting involved in the space, I was able to use, a broke college student, really didn't have any funds, but I was able to use those very first assets to get the business going, essentially focusing on decentralized storage, allowing people to rent out their extra hard drive space, just like I rented out my extra compute power to mine Bitcoin, and then selling that to businesses and developers. And this was a very, new technical concept that used, Bitcoin and blockchain under the hood. And so as I went out to go raise venture financing, there was two things against me. One, this was a very new technology. Talking about Bitcoin and blockchain in 2015, they'd be like, that's used for drugs and guns, right? And number two, as a young Black founder, I really didn't have access to the kind of network in terms of VCs. And I'd go into meetings, bring my white business partner, and they would, as the CEO at the time, they would go shake his hand because he's an older white gentleman instead of mine first. And so those little micro things in terms of access and being able to raise capital was very different. But I found in the crypto space, people are really hungry for the next technology and the next area. And they were much more open towards, hey, this is really cool technology. We really love it. We want to be able to support you. So in 2015, I was able to raise $500,000 to start this idea through essentially a token sale. And then in 2017, we were able to do another token sale to raise $30 million to really grow the project and product. And those are things that were not possible for me to get access to. The amount of resources that we needed to build this was just not possible through traditional VCs. Now in this market, there's a lot of excitement. But when we really were on the ground floor and we needed that help, it came from the crypto community.
And Deidre, that idea of the ground floor is something that you've talked about a lot in your work and your writing. This idea that, folks need to be paying attention at risk of being kind of left out in the way that some people were during the first .com boom. Of course, the first .com boom ended poorly, so that is, certainly something that folks need to keep in mind. But, going back to this idea of, as the point that Sean was making, is crypto in fact more welcoming to people of different kinds of backgrounds in your experience?
No, I think we're facing the same challenges that occurred during the early .com boom. If you look at the number of startup companies, with Sean being the exception, but if you look at the number of startup companies, there's still tremendously cisgendered white males that hire other cisgendered white males. And maybe there's a little bit of diversity on some of the marketing aspects and human resources, sort of the fringe thing or the lone individual, but we really don't see, the pluralism that you would expect that's coming out of things that should be funded in our country or even overseas in Europe and elsewhere, especially on the African continent. I think those of us who are Black that are in this space and crypto being like the internet being borderless, we have a tendency talk across nationalistic and continent lines, and we get feedback from the African continent that it's easier to be a white male founder on the continent of Africa than it is to be a Black founder, even with a software engineering degree. So I think we still have a long way to go with fight for in the space, and so that people can be funded to not even just resolve problems, but to bring global brands into the marketplace, even in the crypto sector.
Thank you so much for saying that. I mean, I find this disconnect to be fascinating. Bloomberg's own Kayla Gardner, in a story in April, reported that while fewer Black Americans invest in stocks than white people, they're more receptive to holding cryptocurrencies. And there's this tremendous and potentially untapped or undertapped market of folks who are out there, with the sort of the ingenuity and sort of the innovative presence of mind of someone like Sean, who are really looking to get into those kinds of spaces, and to your point, may feel kind of excluded. Blair, what are the kinds of things that you are noticing in the UK market, and what are the kinds of things that, I think Gemini is partnering or has partnered with, various groups that are focused on getting more folks from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds into this space and aware of the space, and I'd love for you to share more about what you're up to.
Yeah, look, I think, I hear the points made on this panel, and we definitely recognise that there's a lot of work to be done. And the fintech crypto space, has obviously historically been, primarily white males, I guess. And so there's a lot more to be done to kind of increase representation across kind of leadership and executive levels, kind of, and even at Gemini. And we're kind of, and we're not alone. And as I say, this is definitely, broadly across the crypto space and tech space at large. And, our journey is a lot earlier than most. But, rather a lot later than most, rather. So we were founded in 2014. But, one of the really important things is about having, a goal of true diversity and to make it a kind of a source of continuous improvement. If we look, in the UK, from our perspective on the UK market in particular, we've got quite a diverse group here. So 75% of the UK Gemini force is female, and there's a wide kind of ranging different background of diversity in that space as well. And it's really important that, it's a really important part of our growth that it remains a really safe and diverse space, and that we can continue to kind of encourage that as part of all of our recruitment processes. You're absolutely right in terms of, we've done a whole bunch of stuff, and certainly kind of on the US side, with the Black Blockchain Summit, the Crypto for Culture Diversity Conference, the US National Policy Network for Women of Color and Blockchain. More locally in the UK, we've actually also, as part of our sponsorship for the boat race, we launched the Gemini Bursary Fund. Was actually a fund that originally we put £75,000 into. It was oversubscribed, but that enabled whole groups of people across the UK from a variety of different diverse backgrounds and to get access to rowing, which is historically not necessarily a particularly diverse sport, but it gives them.
I'm gonna pause you there. Can you share for the folks in the audience why rowing is so important to Gemini?
Oh yeah, well, rowing is a big part of our background. Tyler and Cameron Winklevoss were both rowers at the Oxford as part of the Oxford and Cambridge boat race, which is the one we sponsored, and also we're Olympians. So as part of that as well, rowing as a concept also breeds some really positive, a really positive ethos. It's about working together, so definitely it kind of fits into our not only our narrative but also the way we want to do things, which is working collaboratively, working together, and working as one team. So that's a bit of background as to why rowing was really kind of interesting to us. But I guess what I'm kind of definitely trying to evidence here is that, look, we have to be conscious of this, and we've made some significant strides, and and it's not just kind of it's at all grades that we've made those strides. So for the UK and the EU market, our head of Ireland is female. We've got a head of compliance in the UK is female. We've got a very importantly diverse background and culture here, but we'll continue to kind of work with that, and we'll continue to ensure that that Gemini is looking to lead the way and ensuring that diversity remains a key part of the way that we're looking to kind of set up our resources globally.
Thank you for sharing that. And Deidre, going back to the point that you made about Nigeria, which just recently debuted its own digital currency, which is a different kind of conversation about what the future of money could look like. Certainly one of the trends that I'm seeing as, an editor and a person trying to stay on top of this coverage all the time is there are very different attitudes within different countries as it relates to crypto. As Sean put so memorably, there's, I say, the spectrum of like, is this all just guns and drugs, or is this like the greatest thing ever? And what I would, love in the closing minutes that we have is for sort of each of you to just share a little bit about what you think some of the most interesting things are that you're seeing at that country level. Deidre, you've written about how the fact that the US's approach to crypto like really risks leaving certain types of folks behind. So I'm gonna, Sean, if I may start with you, just like who are you looking to? What are you seeing? What's interesting?
Yeah, so the area that I like to focus on is the area of very practical decentralized applications. Things where you're using kind of on the daily basis, like you need to store your data. Obviously, we're a decentralized cloud storage provider, and so we really focus on things where you can practically use the technology. There's certainly a lot of talk about uses in terms of Bitcoin and others in terms of investment, and that's a very interesting area. But we try to focus in on practical use, everyday uses. I think it's really interesting if you look at the core ethos of Bitcoin and blockchain, Ethereum, and all these this whole ecosystem is really, while there's been slow progress towards this movement, is to provide access to billions of people around the world who are unbanked, who don't have access to financial systems, and which would make a huge impact in terms of their daily lives. And so that's really where we're trying to march towards. I think there's still a lot of work to be done, and you have different countries who are on different regulatory spectrums. From Bitcoin, is an amazing thing, to let's ban it completely. We don't want our citizens to have access to this. But I think economics will always speak for itself, and I think that's the way that we're marching. And so whether that happens on the person-to-person level or on the country level in terms of specific countries pushing crypto, we'll see where it goes. But I think it's definitely a very positive movement that ideally is to help lots of people and give people financial access, which is really transformative into people's lives. But it's going to take time, just like the early internet did.
And Deidre, are there any countries that you think are an interesting example of this right now, positively or negatively?
I think positively, I think out of Kenya, the Wive protocol. Wive is built on the Bitcoin blockchain, but this idea of creating a cryptocurrency to be used in the solar sector, that's an anti-poverty focused. I mean, the mission initially was how do we have rural traditional living Africans be able to enter into the currency world with something that they have as a commodity, and they have the sun in tropical regions, not just in Africa, but throughout the world. So if they're out there and they have these digital devices that are collecting this solar power, why can't that be converted to a currency that they can use when they have to interact with more urban centers and for more urban needs? So the Wive, WHIVE, I'm really excited about that. In terms of that, I think we have to, okay.
Go ahead. I think we've lost you briefly.
I think okay. We have.
Okay. Don't even worry about it. Well, thank you. I feel like I have 4 or 5 different story ideas to go ask my reporters to look at after talking to all of you today. So thank you very, very much to you, Deidre, you, Sean, and you, Blair, for joining us from various parts of the country right now and others. And thank you to everyone for tuning in for this session. You can find more about Bloomberg News' coverage of crypto on @crypto if you're on Twitter, and on the terminal, of course.
There are 75 countries in the world where it's still illegal or really difficult to be LGBTQ. That's, from my perspective, just a huge waste of human potential. I kept having these conversations with people that said, yes, there's a real challenge here to solve. The global LGBTQ movement is so underfunded. And then it came to a point where it was clear this was something I really needed to get done in my life. And I actually asked to move to a part-time model, and BCG and my colleagues were hugely supportive of that. In just over 3 years, We've raised over $2 million for LGBTQ grassroots activists around the world. We've helped to set up the first ever trans network in the Caribbean. And actually, when we were preparing to launch, BCG then came on board as our founding corporate sponsor for Give Out. At the time, I kind of felt it made me more of an outsider at BCG. And then some years later, I was actually invited to talk to our global partnership about it. And it really kind of fried my brain, because here I was being celebrated as a true BCGer for the thing that I thought was going to, lead me to leave the firm. But I'm deeply grateful for, how the firm has supported me through it. Working for 20, 30, 40 years and then thinking about how to do something for the community. That's an old model, and I think it's a broken one.
Some of the clients in the organization, they just didn't think that it was necessary for us to make any change. The case we did at Grundfos was actually a really good example of that. They already had one female C-suite member, and they already had several initiatives, so why should they do more? And then we actually conducted a survey, and the results were quite surprising. And now they have actually hired a diversity, equity, and inclusion leader, and they are going full steam ahead on the initiatives that we developed together with them. When I was hired in almost a decade ago, I didn't think that being a female or being an ethnic minority necessarily gave me an edge. And over the past few years, I realized that my own background is actually a strength. It has given me more motivation to be who I am and leverage the differences that I have compared to some of my other colleagues. And I think it's extremely motivating to then transfer that knowledge and experience to some of our clients to help them also get on board this journey.
Between March and May of 2020, there were a range of police shootings and violence against underrepresented minorities in the U.S. Atlanta wanted to understand better their baseline, where they stand relative to other large metropolitan cities. This elicited, a lot of emotions, right? And seeing a lot of the stats, particularly Black men, in this case in the U.S., and then realizing that this is one symptom of a systemic issue, it's hard to grapple with, right? After digging in and trying to think through some targeted initiatives, I felt a sense of empowerment, right? Being able to engage with the administration, work with community leaders, communicate that to police leadership, implementing sustainable change. That's powerful. Being able to engage with the city has done a great deal for not only my professional development, but also some of my personal passions around, equity more broadly for Black Americans across the U.S. I think the key is to acknowledge that there's a lot to do, but not to let that impede us in the progress. And topics regarding equity, equality, there aren't always clean solutions that will easily drive consensus. And so creativity and compromise, are key to making that progress. For me, being from Atlanta, seeing the administrative orders that were executed by the mayor, and then also seeing the response from news outlets, from the community leaders, from the police department, and the reconciliation efforts that are happening post this work, I think just hits at a different level.
BCG is proud to sponsor the Bloomberg Equality Summit and to share these stories of leaders and allies who are unlocking the potential of those who advance the world.
Hi there, and welcome to this special edition of Out of Office, the podcast in which I ask my guests questions they don't typically get asked when they're in the office. My guest today is the founder and CEO of one of the world's most valuable fintech startups. Millions of consumers around the world use a buy now, pay later service, and a good number of them use Klarna. It's a $5 billion company, and it was founded when Sebastian Szymanowski was still a student. Sebastian, welcome to Out of Office.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
With Klarna, which uses a model that you can buy now, pay later, but there is no interest, there are no fees, it does allow a lot of people to afford things they wouldn't normally be able to. I'm curious, what drew you to this model of financial inclusion?
Well, we started actually in a slightly different angle because we started in markets that were predominantly debit card markets where people haven't picked up credit cards to the same extent they did in the US and the UK, such as Sweden and Germany. And in those markets, we realized that debit cards are great. You know, preferably people should always spend money they have, but there are obviously occasions when credit makes sense. And especially one of them is when you shop online, because the delivery of the product doesn't happen at the same point of time you make the purchase. So when you use a debit card, you're kind of risking your money and hoping to receive the item that you saw on that picture on the web. And so already there, you know, already when we started 16 years ago, people felt that's a little bit unsafe shopping online. That was still the case back then. So credit provided them with the trust and security of, you know, touching and feeling the product before they paid for it. And then obviously also we started seeing other benefits. Like if you do a return today, you may wait for 3 weeks until the merchant settles the return, which means that, you know, credit card, you don't really care because it's just your balance. But on a debit card, you're actually waiting for your money that you want to spend elsewhere. So so we realized that in an environment where you shop online, credit makes a lot of sense. And additionally to that, we also saw that, you know, the smoothing out of your cash flow is actually helpful if it's done at a low cost to help people, you know, understand the economy and get closer to that question we all need to ask ourselves: am I living above or below my means? Well, if you smoothen out your economy, if you smoothen out your cost and your incomes so that it's easier to track both, then it's actually easier to understand that as well.
Well, there's been a massive boom in the number of people using this kind of a financial model. And I understand the rationale behind, you know, I can't afford to buy something unless I spread the purchase out. At the same time, there is a fear, and sometimes a legitimate fear, that it could push people into debt. How does this sit with you from a moral point of view?
Yeah, I think, look, myself, I was brought up in an immigrant family, and my parents struggled with that when I was a kid. So I have a very, you know, strong emotional connection to what that means and what impact it has on people's lives. I think that what credit is, you know, that's what's exciting and challenging about credit. I actually think credit overall is good. It's good for society. I think it's helped economic growth. I think it can be good for consumers as well. But I think most of us, in a large proportion, especially in the US and UK, have been using credit cards. And those products have already, you know, historically meant that people may have spent more than they could afford. And also those products, unfortunately, were built in a different time where people running these businesses back in those days did not have their customers' best interests at heart. So there were, you know, they created all kind of dirty tricks to encourage us to spend more than we could. For example, they push the credit limit in your face all the time because that, you know, is proven to increase the likelihood of you spending more than you have. They have constructed revolving, which is a very strange concept where you take your whole monthly statement and you borrow against it, against your groceries, against everything you purchased, and then every month you pay 1/24th, less and less. So you actually pay, you know, you can those, we call them like infinity loans. You pay on that forever. So there's a lot of these things that the credit card companies did that wasn't necessarily in our best interest. And so what we realized is we think that the future is not as simple to say, let's ban all credit, because that's not going to work, but it's finding better products. And those products should be built, one, they should be low cost. You know, we don't charge interest as an example because merchant pays for the cost of our product. But they should also be easy to understand. It should be installments. They should be fixed term. They shouldn't be revolving, and so forth. So we think, as like everything else equal, if 10 years from now, less people have credit cards and more people have debit cards, but then occasionally they use buy now, pay later when it makes sense, versus more people having credit cards, we think that's a better world. And that's why I feel that's what makes me sleep well at night.
You mentioned you were an immigrant kid. Your parents moved from Poland to Sweden, like many immigrants do, in search of better opportunities. But I know it didn't really work out that way for your family, and it was rough when you got to Sweden. How did that influence your views towards money?
No, I don't think it's a coincidence that, I think some time I read that 50% of the tech companies in Silicon Valley are started by immigrant kids. I think that transition from, I think my parents gave up, on their families, on their friends, and all of the security that comes from that to move into a totally different environment where they didn't know the language. And they did it for us. They did it for me. They did it for me and my sister because they wanted to give us a prerequisite to have a different type of life. And I think that when you've grown up with that background, it creates a tremendous drive, a tremendous interest in trying to, shape your own life, do something with it. And you also know that, I couldn't trust on anyone getting me a job or anything. Like I get my own job. I got my first Burger King job when I was 15 years old, and then I got tons of other jobs. Mm-hmm. So I think it creates something very healthy in that sense, a lot of drive, a lot of passion, and also a sense of you do want to kind of correct that injustice, because my parents were intellectuals, academic backgrounds, really well read. And my father ended up driving a cab or being unemployed. And as much as cab can be, an amazing job, for him, it was very, very tough. And I think that you kind of get the sense you want to correct that, what you kind of feel is unfair. I don't know whether fairness really exists in life, but you feel that there's that thing. And so I think that is what, what creates a drive. And to some degree, because my parents divorced as well, I did kind of associate their divorce with a lack of money, because that was the discussion at home all the time. We can't afford this, we can't do that, and so forth. So obviously I did to some degree believe that, money would be an important way to solve the problems of the family, which unfortunately turned out to not entirely work that way. But as a child, at least, that was my interpretation.
As a child, I did read that, you ate pancakes for your meals sometimes for days on end. And of course, as a kid, you think, whoa, that's great. But then later on, you realize that the reason you were eating pancakes is because your family couldn't really afford groceries. If you had a Klarna kind of business model available to you back then, would things have been smoother, perhaps, for your family?
I tend to believe so. And I know some people, people are always going to challenge me on this point, right? Because people think, but you're a bank, you borrow money and so forth. Yeah, but I know you can sit on the side and complain about banking, complain that, some of the business models aren't great, or that credit cards leads to overspending, or you can actually launch a bank and try to do it better. And that's, I think, kind of what we've done now. I should be clear, though, that was not the case when we started a company. When we started a company, we were simply trying to build a service that worked and people were willing to pay for because they felt it brought value. But to me, it's a difference. When you start a restaurant, you have one type of responsibility. When that restaurant suddenly turns into McDonald's, you have a different type of responsibility. So you need to think about these things as you grow up and your industry, your business changes. But with that said, yeah, I do believe so. I think the kind of holy grail of finances and banking must be to help your users understand, am I living above or below my means? And that sounds like a simplistic question, but it's actually very hard for most people to really understand, because their income comes in different, they may get salary every second week, but then they have some taxes coming back or whatever. And then their spending is all over the place. Sometimes they have, a month of tremendous spending and sometimes much less. And then what if I finance this car and at that price, I may get a car with lower fuel consumption, and then that might be better for my monthly cost. But if I do this, and so it's actually quite difficult for people to really be able to grasp in real time to what degree. And actually credit and installments can help smoothen out, if it's done at the right cost, help smoothen out and understand to a better degree how you are in regards to that question. So I do think that it's part of the solution. It's not the whole solution, obviously. And there are tons of situations also where credit actually makes a lot of sense, even financially speaking. I mean, take it as an example, many cities today, if you buy an annual card for the metro, you're going to save a lot of money compared to buying everyday tickets. But not everyone can afford to do that. So that's a great example of there's tons of situations, obviously, where credit actually makes sense, especially if the credit is cheap or low interest, then actually it's also financially correct to use it, right? So it's a little bit more complex than sometimes portrayed in media and so forth. It gets simplified a little bit, but that's why it's great we have these longer conversations so we have time to talk about it.
No, exactly. How has your own personal life story influenced your views towards immigration? It has become, Europe faces a migration crisis. I know it is sensitive and yet a politically charged issue in Sweden. You have elections coming up next year. What is your position on immigration?
Ooh, now you got me. This is a very tough question for me. But I have been very, consistent in my opinion on this. I think I understand any country's concern about, we have limited resources. How much do we spend on this and that? And I can understand that perspective. But at the same point of time, look, from my world, it's just that, like, if I'm, if there's a war going on or something's going on in a country, those people are in desperate need. They need help now, right? And at least personally, from my own perspective, I just don't understand how I'm supposed to be able to say no, especially since we, in a lot of the countries that this refers to, already live in what is, a very, very different level of quality lifestyle and access to food and the most basic supplies. So to me, it's very foreign, the idea to not to say no to people in that need. And then I understand that then once you've said yes, then you help them. You got to figure out also what happens after that and integration and so forth. So I don't want to pretend that these are simplistic questions. They're very complex, and I'm not a politician. I'm not a society person. I don't have answers. I'm just a banker trying to build products for consumers. But I think that, but at least that's from an empathetic perspective, it's very, very difficult for me to say no when something acute is going on. And then secondly to that, my impression is all the time, when Poland was supposed to, since it's my home country, when it was supposed to enter the European Union, a lot of the other European countries actually closed their borders and didn't allow for the first couple of years for Polish people to move to other countries. Sweden did not. Sweden did allow it. And tons of fantastic people, both plumbers and builders, as well as engineers and all kinds of works, moved to Sweden with that background. And, I cannot, sometimes to me, it feels just that it's the irony of the world that I wonder whether the biggest, maybe, loser in that sense was Poland themselves, who's seen tons of ambitious, really hardworking and smart people move abroad rather than stay in that country. So maybe it should have been Poland that should have been worried and close the borders rather than the other way around. Because I think these people have significantly contributed to the economical growth of their neighboring countries.
I want to go back to what you mentioned about your father. And your father was an immigrant. He moved from Poland to Sweden. He was highly educated. He had a doctorate, but he struggled to find work. He drove a cab. You've admitted that he struggled with alcoholism. He had it pretty rough. What did you learn from his struggles?
Wow, it's a good question. Well, first and foremost, I was, ironically, even though my father did struggle with alcoholism, because I was drinking myself, I did not recognize that I had a similar problem, right? And so that's just how strange it can be. But I did eventually realize, and I did stop. I'm a sober alcoholic today since actually 10 years. I think I celebrate 10 years of sobriety today. I should make some off of that, yeah.
Absolutely, congratulations.
Thank you. So I think that obviously seeing that, it is, it obviously, it's a tough question and it breaks my heart because he was an amazing partner, had such potential. But I do think that as that was growing, that disease was growing with him, it became tougher and tougher for him. And I think that was what didn't allow him to fully function in society as well. But I think, so I learned that that's hard, but I think maybe the most important lesson and the toughest one was that, I always believed that I was going to help. I was going to, create money for myself, and then I was going to support my family. And it turned out, especially when somebody's in that situation, that you sometimes helping, you have to do the opposite. You actually have to set limitations. And as much as I tried to support him financially first, I realized that was actually fueling his ability for his abuse. And so I had to stop doing that, and I was counseled to stop doing that. And that was extremely tough. Extremely difficult to start setting limitations to my own father in regards to these topics. But it taught me that, being nice and being kind isn't always just about, just supporting without any limitations, but it actually can be the best thing you can actually do sometimes is put limits. I think that was the biggest learning for me from that, and made me also think a lot about in a social democratic country like Sweden, where do you put the limit between supporting people and supporting people to be successful for themselves? And finding that balance, I think, is maybe among the most difficult ones that any government faces, really.
Well, I mean, very tough balance, absolutely. And you never really got a chance to say goodbye to your dad either, is that right?
No, I mean, that was, was maybe the toughest part of my story with him, right? Because we were in a situation where he wanted my financial support because he was getting evicted from his apartment. And I was struggling. I found that very, very difficult. I didn't know what to do with that because, was I going to support him or not? Or would this be an opportunity for him to take responsibility of his own life? And I was very mixed. And then he made a phone call to me in the afternoon, about 5, 6 o'clock. And I saw his phone number, and I just didn't feel I had yet decided, and I didn't have an answer for him. So I decided to not answer. And then, a few hours later, when I had decided, I tried to call him, I couldn't get hold of him. I tried to email him, I couldn't get hold of him. But that happened all the time, so I didn't really reflect on it that much. But I had some uneasy feeling in my stomach. And in the morning, my mother called me and said that he was dead. So that was obviously a very tough situation for me.
Oh, I can't even imagine how difficult that must have been for you. But I know in your early years with him, you had some wonderful memories, and you shared some really good times with him. And he was very encouraging of you and your young business ideas. You had started to dabble in business when you were very young. You read Richard Branson's books on business, and your first business plan involved a local radio station.
Yeah, it was actually only one among many, though, unfortunately. But I think, and it's right, though. But you remind me of something that's very true, though, which is that that's always what I really appreciate with my dad. Is that, when I was a kid and I would come home and say, I'm going to start this. For example, we were living in one place where there was in Uppsala, my home city, everyone was bicycling. Nobody was taking their car, so there was it was a bicycle road, and everyone was bicycling to that. And I was like, a lot of traffic coming by, a lot of customers. So I started making these drawings that I wanted to sell there, and I was mass producing drawings. I asked my parents to give me much more paper and pen, and I was like, I'm seriously 7 or 8 years old, and I'm going to sell all these drawings to the people biking by. But the thing is, they never ridiculed me. Dad never ridiculed me. He never laughed about that. He always supported that, and he was always very supportive in that. And he always they really gave me tons of support in that case, and he also stretched my fantasy. And I have wonderful memories of when he would take me out in the forest and he would talk about Asimov and the Foundation that's now big on Apple was one of our favorite books we read together, and other things like that. So he stretched my imagination in a way that I really hope to be able to do with my own children as well.
So you've been an entrepreneur since you were very young. What are the essential qualities for an entrepreneur? And as an entrepreneur, but also a leader of a very large and valuable firm today, what's the most essential quality a business leader needs to have, in your view?
Yeah, first and foremost, I think there's many paths to success. So people always want that silver bullet, but I think there's many ways. But I think, at least for me, I think what is very valuable is obviously being service-minded. When I was working at Burger King when I was 15 and a family dropped the Coca-Cola out in the restaurant, I would run out with a new Coke and fix it and clean up for them and really make it. And I kind of realized that you don't always get that quality of service at Burger King. Unfortunately, as much as I think I'm sure the company aspires for it. So I realized that for whatever reason, I really enjoyed putting a smile on people's faces. And I enjoyed the part of service I really like is it's about empathy. It's about really understanding the customer's perspective of the situation. So to me, it's really connected to empathy. Actually, having a strong empathy is about understanding the customer, being obsessed about the customer. I think that's critical. I think, lack of patience, of just being, want everything to happen today. Just now. I think that's important. And then for many years, I did not believe I was a competitive person, which was really funny because I didn't feel I was competitive, because I would go bowling with my friends and they would all say, they would win, and I would be like, whatever, I don't care. But then I watched this movie about Björn Borg, the fantastic the Swedish tennis legend.
Yes,
And
of course, yes.
Yeah, and he was, he was similar to me, a young kid from not the most wealthy background. And at that point in time, tennis was still a sport for the wealthy. so
Right.
he got ridiculed by a lot of his friends. And then his coach came in, and there's a scene in the movie where his coach said, and I was watching this on the plane, his coach says, "Björn, you're not like the other boys. This is a matter of life and death for you." And they don't feel that way. And when I heard that, I started crying in the plane. People were like watching me. What is he watching? Björn Borg? Like, why is he crying? But I realized, like, that's how I feel. That's how I feel about Klarna. It's a matter of life and death for me. That what we do is successful in our work, that our customers are happy. I mean, that's how much I care. And so then I told this to my management team, and they started laughing hilariously. They're like, "You're the most competitive guy we ever met. What the hell are you talking about?" But to me, even this was 14 years into my career or something, it was a revelation that I hadn't really understood, obviously that competitive aspect of my nature.
And it took Björn Borg to explain that to you.
Exactly.
Talking about empathy, I know that giving back is very important to you as well. And you have launched a fund. And I'm curious, are you going to use that fund to invest in tech startups? Would that be a way of giving back to an ecosystem that has helped you survive and thrive?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question and something that we talk a lot. I think there's one thing that I really like in Sweden. There's a word that you can't translate to English, and it's called eldsjäl. It's actually if you go to Daniel X Twitter, you find that he has eldsjäl as his name, and it means fire soul. So fire and soul, right? And the reason it's different is because it doesn't represent entrepreneurs. It represents people that are passionate about something, people that really are, devoted to some kind of cause or something. And my point is that entrepreneurs can sometimes be fire souls. They can be genuinely driven by creating value for the customers, solving things. There's entrepreneurs that are more driven by making a buck, making money, and that's fine. I'm not judging. I'm just saying people are different, and that's okay. But you will also find fire souls in NGOs. You will find politicians that are fire souls. You will find them running the local small arts club, And so that's why I love that expression, fire souls. And I think that, when I think about Give One and what we're trying to give back, it's less critical to me whether they are, for profit or non-profit and so forth. It's really, how do we identify those fire souls, and how can we support them, and how can we remove as many layers between them and their support so they can really go and do whatever they're passionate about. And because in the end, that fire soul is always focused at the impact, and that's what matters. It's you put some resources in, and you want as much impact to come out as possible. And unfortunately, even in the NGO world, you will find tons of places where people go there because it looks nice and it's nice and I'm supportive. It doesn't necessarily mean that all the resources that are donated come to the right, to the best use always, right? So as the same as companies. So you have that in all parts of the world. So I think that that's really what we're focusing on, thinking about it as how can we support such initiatives that we think are populated by such individuals, whether for profit or non-profit, that actually can make an impact.
Sebastian, this podcast is called Out of Office. What's your favorite thing to do when you're not in the office?
So fortunately, I have 3 wonderful children. They're 4, 6, and 8. So that's
a busy age. Busy ages.
Very much indeed. So that's amazing. But then if I do tell, there's one, I actually had my 40th birthday, and my wife gave me this fantastic gift, which is the one thing that I do for myself occasionally. It doesn't happen too often or anything, but it's actually horseback riding. So there's nothing it's nothing that clears my mind to just galloping on a horse, feeling the wind, feeling the horse below me. It's just it's amazing, and it's fun, it's fast, and it's slightly unpredictable because you never know what the horse is going to do. But it's a fantastic thing that I really enjoy doing.
Well, I hope you get a lot of chances to do that. Sebastian Chmielowski, thank you so much for being with us on Out of Office.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hoffman, partner at Greylock, co-founder of LinkedIn, and one of the wisest I have found over my 10 years covering technology voices in Silicon Valley. Reed, great to have you back with us today for Bloomberg Live.
Always great to be here. Yes.
I want to start with your new seed fund, this $500 million you have now dedicated for seed and early stage investing. That strikes me as a huge opportunity to try to level the playing field a little bit in Silicon Valley and reach a more diverse set of entrepreneurs than we typically see. Are you doing anything differently in terms of how you're doling out this money to reach a different and new group of people?
Well, we have been systematically, we think if we build the network very strongly around Greylock and we build it intentionally to be more diverse and more inclusive, we will naturally get to better funding of diverse entrepreneurs, bringing diverse executives into companies. We're specifically working with people who focus on building these networks. So, management leaders of tomorrow, we've been doing a whole bunch of stuff with across the entire organization and network with the executives. We've been doing stuff with a variety of call it network venture funds and feeders. So there's like 645 Ventures and Village Global and other things in order to get a higher set of entrepreneurs and executives coming in. Obviously, we also look at that as a potential feeder to how we hire and diversify our partnership itself as well, because that's part of how venture firms, we're very small entities, is like 8 partners. How do we make that more diverse? Is the answer is we get to know people through our network. And so we have this very network-oriented approach, and obviously working at the earliest stages in seed, as per the new fund, the fund extension. That's the that of course is opportunities that we're planning on fully developing.
Now, it's been 4 years since the Me Too movement. At the time, you wrote the Decency Pledge, calling on venture firms to have a zero-tolerance policy for bad behavior. Everyone said, sign me up. Yes, of course. I agree. And now that we're coming out of the pandemic, there's this concern that we've lost some of that momentum, that women have lost some of the progress they made. In fact, funding to women-led and mixed-gender teams has dropped from an already low 16% to 14%. I'm curious if this is a concern for you, and if so, how do we keep driving towards this? How do we recapture that momentum in 2022?
Well, just as I was earlier mentioning that we work with a variety of groups building networks, and it's enough of them that I couldn't list them all. All Raise is another one that we've been working with, and that's particular on the gender front. It's conferences, women entrepreneurs, office hours, investors, as kind of ways of making that. That is obviously, it's extremely disheartening to say we're going in the wrong direction. We're already small numbers. Make the numbers bigger. It should be easier to go the other direction, please. And so I think it's, if anything, what that suggests, generally speaking, the advice that I give people is it's not just enough to be a good person, have good intent. If you're not actually, in fact, being part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So you should be investing in it. You should be building your network, spending more time, and doing it even before, like the respective entrepreneur, she or person of color or anyone else has a company, help them get on that path. And that's actually one of the responsibilities you have. And that's part of the reason why at Greylock, we emphasize and invest a lot in the building of the network, hopefully to our benefit too, but to the benefit of the ecosystem.
Now, you've spoken out about so many issues over the course of your career, and more so recently, not just the Decency Pledge, but you spoke out against President Trump. I believe I remember you saying he was less than useless as president. How do you decide when to make a stand like that?
So obviously, in many ways in business, you want to be, there's a different form of inclusivity, of being respectful in dialogue in a number of different points of view. And I think that's important as leaders. when you have something that's fundamentally threatening the value infrastructure, the rules infrastructure, the rule of law infrastructure, then I think you have to take a stand. And I think one of the responsibilities of leaders, any leaders, business leaders, kind of academic leaders, not just political leaders, is to say when you see something that has a deep moral importance, being human first is super important, and then to speak out. And you have to do it in a way that, for example, people say, well, are you anti-Republican? It's like, no, actually, I support Charlie Baker, Republican, governor of Massachusetts. Jeb Bush is a friend of mine. I mean, they're actually, in fact, like I value a diversity of opinion on a variety of important subjects. But the important thing is being good human beings, right? And having that within our infrastructure. And that's when you need to speak up. And actually speaking up as a business leader, for example, is not only okay, but I think mandated. Because when you're a leader, you have power. What kind of society are you helping us become? And neutrality on morality topics is not really there, right? Like, the classic historical instance of it is say, well, the Germans are shipping the Jews off to these camps, and I don't know, I'm not doing it. You're like, well, okay, if you're not acting against it, you're part of the problem. That's obviously the extreme historical example, but then you begin to be more, you should be more thoughtful and active about when are these fundamental moral issues, and then I have to speak up and lead on them.
The problem, I think, for executives is every day there seems to be a new issue, whether it is an abortion law in Texas or, a meltdown in Afghanistan, something about climate. And, in some cases, it involves or seems to involve taking a political stand. Even just developing a COVID vaccine policy for your office seems to be political. How do you advise companies tactically on that day-to-day basis, whether and when to speak up?
So just because someone's claiming it's political and making noise doesn't mean that it's political and you shouldn't talk on it, right? Because then you, of course, allow the crazies to set the rules. So, for example, take vaccination. It's obviously that when you look at in detail kind of the vaccination issues, the importance in public health, the fact that if I choose to be unvaccinated, I am threatening other people's healths. It's kind of like I'm holding a gun to them. Maybe it's not a 6-shooter roulette window. Maybe it's like a 30-shooter, but I'm still pulling the trigger as I go around and talk to people. And it's like, okay, I have a political right to do that. You're like, no, you don't. You're threatening other people's healths. Right? That's what you're doing. And so being thoughtful and active on it is very important. And just because other people are speaking out and saying it's political doesn't mean it's that. Like if I say, if everyone doesn't adopt my particular religion X, then it's political. It's like, no, that's not the case. And so it's important to be thoughtful and leading on this. And one of the things I think we have as part of kind of a modern society is, look, there is ways to do research, to consider when expertise really does apply, to think about those experts in depth. And so, like vaccinations and so forth, I think is very easy. Now, when you get to issues around, for example, abortion laws, it's much more complicated because there's obviously needs for where I fall on the question of like, well, what are women's rights to their own bodies and how does that play out? There's also worries about, kind of child health and other kinds of decisioning. And the other side is not being unreasonable. And that's, you kind of go, okay, this is a complicated subject we need to work out. Now, do I think Texas is doing it unreasonably? Yes, personally, I think so, right? But on the other hand, that's part of when you kind of go, look, is this a issue that you should speak out on or not within a business leading context versus a personal context is something when it's like, no, this is the fabric for all of us versus like if I were posting on the abortion law, I would post on Medium. I wouldn't post on LinkedIn because it would be kind of a sense of which form of leadership would I be trying to participate in, either as a citizen or as a business leader.
I'm reminded of Michael Jordan and the time he said Republicans buy sneakers too, a reference to the booming Michael Jordan business. And more recently, he said, I never thought of myself as an activist. I thought of myself as a basketball player. I just talked to Steph Curry, who said, I think of myself as both. How do business leaders decide when to be Michael Jordan or Steph Curry in that moment? If there's a concern, something's going to hurt their business.
So I think that part of the thing is, look, ethics is to lean in on ethics and be ethical sometimes takes pain. It hurts. You sacrifice an opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so I think the first principle is this something that's fundamentally important? And can you tell that you're a good and ethical person is because you will take some pain and suffering personally in order to get the right thing to happen. If ethics was always like a walk in the park, it wouldn't be that difficult. We wouldn't talk about it that much. It'd be totally easy, right? But actually, in fact, part of the thing is when do you go, no, I have to take a stand here. I know this will maybe hurt me, maybe hurt my prospects as a leader, maybe hurt my bottom line. Maybe some people aren't, maybe the white supremacists aren't going to buy my sneakers. Great. The white supremacists aren't going to buy my sneakers. That's totally fine, right? And so you have to make that baseline decision. And so there's a question about when do you say, I don't care if those people are going to buy sneakers or not. Those people are not the society we can and should be and aspire to be. Now, on other cases, you kind of go, well, it's also okay to say, well, hey, for example, at LinkedIn, we're about economic opportunity, and we will fight for economic opportunity anywhere, but we don't necessarily fight as much for freedom of speech, right? Because our thing is an enablement of women, people of color, everyone else, all for massive economic opportunity. That's our key thing, not, do I have a right to say the moon is made out of blue cheese, right? That's not our thing, right? So, and so anyway, and so you might say we're an activist there. We're an activist on economic opportunity. Other people might be activists on other things, and I think that's the question of where you might be between like the baseline and then going from the Michael Jordan line to the Steph Curry line.
Now, a couple of weeks ago, I asked you about Facebook. You're an early Facebook investor, and you did something that I've never heard you do before, which is publicly criticize one of your portfolio companies. And you said you're disappointed. I'm curious what the reaction has been to that. Have you heard from Mark Zuckerberg?
I have, although I'm not one of those people who reports on private conversations. It's part of the good relationships I have with a large number of people in the world. But to his credit, he reached out immediately after our broadcast. He said, look, I'm concerned. Why did you say the things that you said? Let's engage in it. Let me inform you more about what we're doing. I hear your call on transparency, and I think we're doing a good job, but maybe we need to do better, and let me talk to you about it. So that was, I thought, again, in the kind of thing of where I'd say, look, I'm supportive, very supportive of him as a learning person and CEO. He didn't go, he said something, I'm just going to ignore him, I'm not going to talk to him. He reached out, which is part of the credit. I do think that we're still, as a body politic, as a public society, saying, all right, it's great that you've been doing this research about what are the negative impacts, and that's good, responsible corporateering. Now, given that it's unclear what you're doing about it, please be more transparent about how you're investing. Please be more transparent about what your theory of this game is about how you improve on these social impacts. Because now we're seeing this credible whistleblower come forward. Yeah, you need to tell us more, right? And I'm looking forward to that still.
We're expecting Facebook to potentially change its name this week to convey this idea of the metaverse. Do you think the company should charge ahead with this new vision when it still has these problems and still has a lot of issues to work out?
Potentially. So I don't have any inside information on the kind of new metaverse vision. I've obviously been thinking about metaverse for a long time. One of my earliest jobs was being a product manager at Fujitsu on this product called Worlds Away. So virtual worlds and metaverses and Snow Crash is something I've had a long personal interest in. But it's kind of a question of, is that transition a transition that will also help on these issues? Like you say, well, here is the way that we are also thinking not just of individual rights, which are very important, and freedom of speech, which is very important, but also how we elevate the fabric of society, how we make discourse better, how we make information sharing better, how we get voices heard across the thing in dialogue with respect, right? Now, if they say, hey, that's all part of what we're doing, then that'll be great. If it's like we're totally ignoring it, you're like, well, you shouldn't be ignoring it right now. Please tell us more about that.
Meantime, I've been dying to get your thoughts on this, especially given the context of the conversation. But former President Trump has announced a new social platform planning to take it public via SPAC to, quote, stand up to the tyranny of big tech. Trump's still banned on Facebook and Twitter. What are your thoughts on this, especially given the responsibility that it sounds like you believe tech companies have to be a force for equality and not division?
Well, I think part of the thing, like you go to business leaders, the very first thing is rule of law. And while the question around like, okay, what was the cause by which you essentially deplatformed a society leader? On the other hand, this was a society leader who was inciting an insurrection. You could actually, and I don't think people are this bold, but you could call that traitorous, right? In terms of actually, in fact, activity. I don't think the accountability for the January 6th actions has been so far done. And if he was, by the way, taking more accountability and kind of saying, look, here are the things I did as a mistake, and here are the things I commit to in the future about not, for example, spreading disintegrative, toxic things about our democracy, namely that the election was stolen versus, by Republican state electors and so forth, which is like just crazy, then it'd be like, okay, I'll take you more seriously. But since clearly you have no concept of the truth, and your notion of starting a new platform is a new propaganda thing, we might as well call it Pravda in order to make it fun, then I obviously don't hope that it goes anywhere.
And given this complex, the continuing complex, very complex dynamics, do you think Mark Zuckerberg should still be in charge of Facebook?
Yes, because I think he is smart and committed and a learner. I look forward to what that path looks like.
All right. Reid Hoffman, partner at Greylock, co-founder of LinkedIn. Thank you for bringing your passion to this conversation and your willingness to speak up. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Emily, as always.
Hello and welcome. My name is Madeline Lim, and I am the co-head of news in Asia for Bloomberg. I am delighted and honored to be speaking today with Maria Ressa, the co-founder and CEO of Rappler, an investigative news outlet in the Philippines. Maria is also a media innovator, a staunch defender of press freedom and the importance of independent journalism. And of course, Maria has been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize this year, together with Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov. Maria won the prize for the work she and Rappler have done to expose Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte's bloody war on drugs, which has killed so many innocent Filipinos. The Nobel Committee referred to it as a war waged against the country's own people. Welcome, Maria, and congratulations. This prize is such a well-deserved.
No, I was just going to say thank you. I think this is for all of us. This is a tough time to be a journalist, and that's what the Nobel Committee spotlighted.
Right, but this prize is also such a well-deserved recognition for your work and your courage in speaking truth to power, or as you like to say, holding the line. How does it feel now that you've had a bit of time to digest the award? What does it mean to you?
I'm still stunned. It's and kind of the night that I got the call from Norway. I really tried to see in between all the interviews. When was the last time a journalist won this? And I think this is a signal. The last time was in 1936, so 85 years ago, and the journalist couldn't go get the award because he was languishing in a Nazi concentration camp. I think this is a very powerful signal that now, again, it's almost like Back to the Future. We're at a moment where freedom of the press, freedom of expression is under threat, and it is systematic, it is global, and it's both a blessing and a curse to be where I am in the Philippines, because I don't think I've had any choice but to act the way I've acted, which is to continue to hold the line. But this is the committee saying, our democracies are only as good as the journalists and the people who demand their rights.
Right. And particularly, I think for someone like you, you have paid such a hefty price for standing up to Duterte and his authoritarian government. If you think about the death threats, the rape threats, you've been inundated with posts filled with hatred and violence. you've been vilified as fake news queen. You and Rappler face all these legal challenges just for the simple task of doing your jobs. And it took the government 3 days to congratulate you for the award. And even then, they also mentioned that you still have to clear your name before the courts. Maria, just for our viewers, could you tell us how this all came about and how did this develop, this situation where, it's okay to be violent, to hate, to spew hatred towards you and towards Rappler?
So I think that kind of the core problem of the cascading failures, which my government exploited, and many other governments have done this globally, is the world's largest distributor of news, where our public sphere is so easily manipulated. The methodology is the same in whatever country you're in. It's, the attacks on social media that come bottom up. And in 2016, the narrative that was seeded is journalist equals criminal. And then in 2017, President Duterte says the same thing top down in his State of the Nation address. A week later, that weaponization of social media was followed by weaponization of the law. I got my first subpoena, and this is my 35th year as a journalist, and in less than 2 years, I had received 10 arrest warrants. It's unbelievable, but the enabling environment for the government to be able to do that is social media. And that's I think, the global alarm, right? We must make sure that facts are protected. And that has become increasingly difficult for journalists around the world.
Right. But do you think we can get this genie back in the bottle? I mean, in the current era of disinformation and lack of trust in the media, right? I mean, there's this anecdote or this story that you tell about how you met Mark Zuckerberg back in 2017, and you warned him about the danger of Facebook's outsized power in the Philippines, where the Facebook is the internet. Now, they're trying, they weren't particularly interested then in addressing it. They're now trying to self-regulate amid all the scandals and whistleblowers and, congressional investigations. The efforts are falling short. What do we need to do to put the genie back in the bottle, and whose job is it in particular?
I always go to this quote that captures where we are. The E.O. Wilson said that our greatest crisis is our Paleolithic emotions, the manipulation of our emotions, our medieval institutions, and godlike technology. How do we put the genie? So how do we put the genie back in the bottle? It's impossible to go back to the way it was. So the first is legislation, but that's going to take years still. The EU is leading in that. You have the UK with its online harms bill, and then you have the US with Section 230. But I think one of the shifts that happened with the latest whistleblower, with Frances Haugen, is that finally there's bipartisan support for legislation, but it's not going to happen fast enough to help us in the Philippines in our presidential elections in May next year. The problem is that the impact of these algorithms are worse in the global South. Let's even talk about Hong Kong, right? The freedoms that have been pushed back have impacted. Jimmy Lai was a friend of mine, right? So I think this is global in scope, and a lot of these things, again, how do you seed acceptance of these draconian actions of government? You seed acceptance through violence and fear, a Duterte formula, and then you repeatedly say it on social media. So you manufacture this reality that acts almost like a fertilizer for when government acts the way it does.
Right. And would you tie this whole disinformation, these platforms that sort of, seem to democratize information, but don't actually, right? Do you tie that directly? Do you think that is directly tied to the way press freedom is under attack all over the world, and particularly in Asia, right? There's data from the Committee for the Protection of Journalists that shows 274 were in prison in 2020. That's a record number. China has now, for the second year in a row, jailed the most, 47. Indeed, one of our own news staff, Hayes Fan, has been detained for 10 months now. You've been arrested in your own newsroom. We've seen, like you said, that happened to Jimmy Lai. Why is this happening now? Is that directly tied, do you think, to technology and the digital platforms? And why is it so pronounced in Asia?
the game changer is technology. And I would think that that really began, journalists, we lost our gatekeeping powers to tech. I would say, the dual realities really began in 2014 in the Ukraine, but the dominoes that impacted elections and democracies really began falling in 2016. So 2015 was when instant articles were introduced by Facebook using the same type of algorithm, just gossip or, the joke you heard. They didn't change the algorithms. And, we keep pushing that news, again, gets treated differently from that facts get treated. But then in 2016, President Duterte was elected in May. Brexit happened less than a month later. And then you had the Catalonia elections, you had the Macron, you had Trump elected in November, right? It's a cascading failure because it's unleashing a virus of lies in an information ecosystem. I always say this is like an atom bomb exploded in our information ecosystem because we cannot tell fact from fiction. That is what the algorithms, that's the way they're designed. And you can actually say that lies laced with anger and hate spread faster and further than facts. So you can say that the world's largest delivery platform for news is biased against facts and bias against journalists. So that has helped turn the world upside down. And, how do we solve it? How do we put the genie back in the bottle? I think legislation, that's first. But beyond that, those of us on the front line, and why our countries? Because our institutions are weaker. We're newer democracies. Corruption was always, feudalistic, paternalistic societies. Corruption was always a factor. And when you allowed power to insidiously manipulate us, these micro-targeting takes on a new power. So changing, even the United States, look at the United States after January 6th, right? They had to break glass. All the American companies were all hands on deck. They're not going to do that for every single election this year. I don't think they'll do that for our elections, but I appeal that they do because we have so much at stake.
Yeah, that's right. I think the upcoming Philippine elections, I'd be interested in your view, like how you assess the sort of the weaponization of social media that we've talked about and how this will impact, in your view, the upcoming elections. How entrenched is this information warfare since 2016?
Since 2016, it's 5 years of that, right? So people and our cognitive biases then stick to what we have. Look, I think our elections in May is indicative of what is really the war. This will be a battle for facts because just a week or so ago, 35 years after the Marcos family was ousted by a people power revolt in 1986, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Bongbong Marcos, is now running for president. And in 2019, Rappler exposed the networks of disinformation that had been created to help him in his run for vice president, which he lost by a narrow margin. Now he's coming at it again. And, in September last year, Facebook actually took down information operations from China that were not just attacking me and Rappler, they were polishing the image of the Marcosists, and they were campaigning for the daughter of President Duterte in the May election. So you see, that was September 2022. So this is geopolitical power play. And to allow this kind of insidious manipulation, I think, makes a farce out of our elections. So we will not have integrity of elections without integrity of facts. So that's an appeal, right? Please turn up the NEQ, the news ecosystem quality. You did it in the United States after January 6th. Do it in the Philippines because our democracy is at stake.
Hand in hand with the spread of disinformation, we've seen a rise in authoritarianism as governments have used the excuse of the pandemic to whittle away civil rights of individuals. How can this trend be reversed? Or are we destined to follow this path, go down this path, where our freedoms just get sort of taken away until they're all gone?
I think that's the signal the Nobel Committee pointed out, right? I think we have to fight for it. I joke because I have a very young team and they follow Marvel. So I just kept saying, Avengers assemble. This is it. We have to actually fight for our rights. Otherwise, we will lose it. I think that nothing is set in stone. It's been a steep decline, but I think that's a warning. And I hope, I always say, I think this will require journalists working together, collaboration on a massive scale. And if an atom bomb exploded in our information ecosystem, it requires a lot more from governments, the same way that they came together post-World War II to create the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think this is another one of those moments. We don't want to go back. We don't want to lose our democracy. I think that's something that needs to be stated by every. Democracy has become a man-to-man, woman-to-woman defense. So, I'm writing this book where I'm asking the question. I've been forced to really lay out my answer. Then the question is simple. What are you willing to sacrifice for the truth? You answer that.
Yeah. Do you get the sense that governments are actually engaging? I mean, you sort of noted Europe, you noted the US, but do they actually sense the urgency that I hear coming from you?
Not always, but I don't stop. That's one. And then I think the second thing is, look at ASEAN and the position it just took on Myanmar. That's new, right? So we have to celebrate the small wins, because this is death by 1,000 cuts, right? And you're right. We have to cover every single one of these cuts because they're bleeding out. But the full thing is that our body politic needs to be able to recover from the blood being drained out. We need to bandage 1,000 cuts. And I think if journalists raise the alarm, if we demand better, not just from governments, but from the tech that is delivering our news, then we'll have a much better chance of protecting, of saving our democracies for the next generation.
I'm afraid we're nearly out of time, Maria, but I do want to bring one last question, the conversation back to you and your incredible journey. The pressures you face and the constant harassment and threats, the prospects perhaps of spending, or perhaps even the rest of your life in jail, the worry that this brings around your safety and well-being. How do you, in your personal life, hold the line? How do you keep believing?
It became real that could be a possibility in 2019 after I kept getting arrested. And I was really exhausted in 2019. I wasn't getting very much sleep. And at that point, I accepted it could be a possibility. It took me a little while, but even the idea of being able to sleep was a good thing. But it is what it is. And then I embrace your fear is something I say all the time. And, we have a fantastic team. And I guess part of what I'm trying to do is I think that whether I go to jail will be dependent on how good a job we do as journalists. So I focus on, here's the path. The corruption investigation at the Senate, we broke a story that had all of the documents connecting these companies. It was with OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. It took us 8 months to do that. I think, I feel better in knowing that even though there's a Damocles sword over my head, that I will not let it allow me from acting the way I normally do, right? Because the first battle is in your mind. I am not going to change. I'm too old to change. So, cease and desist. Give us back our democracy.
Oh, Maria, this has been an amazing conversation, and you're an amazing role model for us all. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your thoughts. And congratulations again to the Nobel Peace Prize. Couldn't have happened to a better person. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all for joining day one of the Bloomberg Equality Summit. We hope you enjoyed these conversations. Thanks again to all of our speakers for a wonderful program. And thank you to our presenting sponsors, Boston Consulting Group and P&G, and supporting sponsor, RBC Capital Markets, and our community partner, UNCF, for making this virtual summit possible. If you'd like more information from our sponsors, please visit the resources tab on your screen. And most of all, thank you for being such an engaged audience. We're not done yet. We have another day of important and exciting conversations, so please join us at 9 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow for day 2 of the Bloomberg Equality Summit. Thank you for being with us.